Hello and welcome to this video on hermaphroditism, a rather poorly understood and often misunderstood set of circumstances. A hermaphrodite by definition is an organism that has both male and female gametes. In a human this is sperm and ovum. No, Futanari does not count. The majority of mollusks, earthworms and tunicates are hermaphroditic, and they are for the most part an exception, as you generally find it's an anomaly rather than a common thing. Typically, hermaphrodism requires both sex organs for production of the gametes. In humans, this would be the ovary and testes. It would mean that a person with hermaphrodism may not have visually or externally obvious signs of being a hermaphrodite. In a manner of speaking, depending on the species, being a hermaphrodite can be kind of horrifying. For example, in snails, either member of the process can be the male or the female. The female receives the gametes, and the male delivers their gametes by shooting a sharp, spear-like projectile into the recipient female. No, that is not what she said. In anime, this is also where we get traps. Traps, for those of you who are still innocent, are characters who appear female and attractive physically, have an attractive personality, or through their actions appeal to the audience. Despite this, it turns out they're actually the opposite sex. And now for the biology and to a lesser extent physiology and anatomy. There are three kinds of hermaphroditism: sequential hermaphroditism, simultaneous hermaphroditism, and pseudohermaphroditism. The three flavors are Mass Effect endings, but it actually has meaning. Sequential hermaphrodites can be divided into further three broad categories. Lots and lots of threes in this video so far. We have protandry, we have protogyny, and we have bidirectional. At least the last one should be fairly obvious, but the first two perhaps less so. A protandry is where the organism starts out as a male and then changes sex into a female. It's the biological drag queen, but way more serious about their choices. Or a child who doesn't yet understand the biology of reproduction and thinks that children can be born from anyone. Or males who take part in female sports, although perhaps that last one is less so. Protogyny is, well, the opposite of protoandry. It's simply a female becomes a male. And the only example we can think of at the moment is Cartman's hand from South Park, or possibly Elliot Page. And bidirectional sex change is, well, exactly what it says. An organism is either a male or a female and switches to the opposite sex. Now, typically speaking, this is a one-off change and only goes from one to the other. But in theory, it can be a oscillating effect where they go from male to female and back to male and so on. In terms of species that, let's say, typically exhibit these things, in terms of protandry, we have a clownfish. So if we're going to use a more familiar context, we can look at Finding Nemo. In this situation, Marlin should have been a practical and simple example of being born one sex, male, and then developing into another sex, the female. Sorry, did you not want your reminiscent memories of a children's movie untainted with ideas of sex changes in biology? Oops. We then have cleaner shrimp, which are known to have a certain symbiotic relationship with other creatures, but they themselves can also make odd relationships, mostly going from male to female. This can occur mostly due to issues around their, let's say, a colony or similar societal issues where suddenly they find that there's an excess of males or an excess of females. And then we have the, interesting and somewhat bizarre phenomena with frogs. And strictly speaking, frogs fit both into protandry and protogyny. It's been observed that frogs can switch between the two sexes, or at least one sex can change into the other as needed.
Like gay people, I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay!
Now, some of this is as a result of human pollution entering the environment, and some other research has indicated it could well be an entirely natural phenomenon within nature that humanity has exacerbated somewhat. Last, we have a bidirectional sex change. No, not someone who hasn't chosen their team, but actually shifting between teams. Growing between 6 and 8 inches long, we have the yellow banana slug. Mind out of the gutter, we are talking about an actual slug this time. It's not a euphemism. What's unique about them is that they are born with both male and female genitalia. And, well, they find a similar-sized mate, and one of them will form essentially a pseudo-vagina of a kind, and the other will put their penis into it, and this ends up with impregnation. The process is then reversed, and the other member also becomes impregnated. On rare occasions, they go at this alone, with the banana slug impregnating itself. This is not the weirdest thing the banana slug does, mind you. It's also known to eat and literally gnaw off its partner's penis. Yeah, it gives a new meaning to eating out. And now that you're likely suitably squirmish, we can move on to the next form of hermaphrodism, that is simultaneous hermaphrodites. This is both correctly and technically correctly called homogamous hermaphrodites. This is where both the male and female sex organs are present and they both work. This is your futanari. This also does on occasion lead to self-fertilization, which is all kinds of accidents you really don't want. More so because you don't even need a broken condom for this to happen. It should also lead to some weird and very uncomfortable conversations about who the father or mother is and trying to redraw your own version of the Spuckler family tree. Most of the time we're looking at mollusks when we talk about this sort of thing, snails, for lack of a better word, among other creatures. And they nearly always have the, extra sex organs. Yeah, we've spoken already about the banana slug, but of course there are plenty of others. Nematodes also come under this particular category, where they can also be self-fertilizing, which, yeah. One of the weirder examples you can see of this in nature, and given what we said so far, I'd call it weird, should have you asking some pretty concerning questions right now, is butterflies. Yes, those are pretty things that flit around in the sky and then put caterpillars everywhere and destroy gardens. Yes, they are also possibly, and rarely, a hermaphrodite, a simultaneous hermaphrodite. And it is a rare occurrence because it often involves weird genetic things going on, but what you end up getting is a butterfly that has one side of it male and one side of it being female. And there are also instances, say, with birds, wherein with birds they can lay a double nucleus egg. This contains both of the necessary chromosomes, and a male can come along and fertilize both of these, leading to essentially an egg that has two distinct, let's say, birds growing in it, growing as one individual, a chimera of sorts. The better kind of chimera and not the sad kind, and because of this, you end up with essentially a male and a female fused into one. Lastly, we have pseudohermaphroditism. Now, this is more popularly called being intersex at the moment, although there is some weirdness about naming conventions, but it's a term for when the gonads are mismatched with the internal reproductive system. Essentially, what's outside the body doesn't match with what's inside the body, and by that we mean typically in the pelvic area. This creates, well, problems, let's say. It was the crux of an entire episode of House MD, wherein a model found that she was a he.
Because we changed your medicine back to the real stuff. Stop talking. Real stuff. Stop talking.
You gave me fake medicine?
That's what I said. In the vain hope that you wouldn't feel the need to also say it. Stop talking.
Wilson already did an ultrasound. Said her ovaries were undersized.
The ultrasound would be the way to go if you were looking for ovarian cancer.
What are we looking for?
Looks like a tumor, doesn't it? Looks like a tumor, doesn't it?
But those are...
Yep.
She has cancer. She has cancer. So it's not cancer. So it's not cancer.
No, it's cancer, but he has cancer.
She's not a guy.
His DNA.
Guy.
His DNA says you're wrong. Frogs and snails and puppy dog tails. You've got male pseudohermaphroditism. See, we all start out as girls, and then we're differentiated based on our genes.
This is arguably far more rare in humans and nature as a whole, which is probably a good thing if only to avoid the confusion. It's something hyenas do not have either the fortune of, or perhaps the awareness of. Spotted hyenas were at first observed as they were thought to be hermaphrodites. The reason for this is that female hyenas that take charge of the pack essentially form a pseudo-penis. It's an incredibly enlarged clitoris, which also contains an external birth canal. Yeah, it's kind of disconcerting. It's not disconcerting because of the bizarre sex organs in and of itself, but the process of giving birth that is a worry. Now, the initial stages are fairly typical. Basically, the cub is passed through the cervix. However, it also now needs to pass through that elongated clitoris. It's, in a manner of speaking, what would happen if a man tried to give birth. Just imagine trying to pass a watermelon through your penis. Yeah, that's what the spotted hyena has to go through, which honestly speaks wonders to the perseverance of the spotted hyena. The fact that the species has not died out so far really does mean that they're dedicated. Of course, they're not the only examples. There are far less interesting examples. For example, the Narave pig, which, due to weird genetic issues, leads to essentially a pseudo-hermaphrodite being formed in the males, but they're mostly kept and bred specifically for ceremonial purposes. And going from animals, which probably has you thinking, do we need to talk about anything else? We now have plants, and in plants things are both a little more complicated and a little more simple. In its basic terms, at least in botany, hermaphrodite refers to any plant that, or at least flowering plant, that has both the staminate, the male pollen-producing element, and the carpellate, which is the female part of the plant flower. The overwhelming majority of flowering plant species are, to a certain extent, hermaphroditic, which is interesting. Admittedly, not necessarily are they able to self-pollinate though, which is where some of the distinctions lie between plants and animals. As a general rule, you can say all plants are hermaphroditic, and you'd have a fairly good chance of getting it right. However, because of some plants, and understand this is the distinction here where it gets complicated, you have some of them that can self-pollinate, and to an extent, these are the minority by far and away. If instead, and this is the other option that's fairly rare, with about 7% of flowers and plants coming under this category, you have monocy. And this is where you have imperfect male and female flowers on the same plant. Essentially, you have a plant that produces a dedicated female flower and a dedicated male flower. About 65% of all plants are instead in the dioecious category, which is they have both kinds of sex organs in one flower. And so essentially 72% of all plants are covered already. And then we have plants that over their lifetime will change their sex, and this is an example of that sequential hermaphrodism we mentioned earlier. And then the last category, which covers a very small portion, about 2% of plants, in which we have andromonaceous species. These are essentially plants and flowers that have a perfectly, essentially a fertile male flower and a completely sterile female flower, which is where things get kind of weird. What happens when you have these weird sterile flowers is that on some of the plants, the male will be sterile, and on others the female will be sterile, and so you need at least 2 of each with the different categories in order to have more of these come about. There's essentially a large range of forms of hermaphrodism in plants, and if we start looking at things like moss and similar, we have even more variation again, particularly when we start talking about things like sequential hermaphrodism, where we have issues around, well, just how many of them change over time. But it means we can apply at least the same basic concepts. We just need to shift our approach a bit, and shift our thinking a little to adjust to the botanist mentality, and understand that may require considerably more shifting in your mentality than, well, other people, given that botanists tend to be a unique classification all of their own. And while plants are certainly not as exciting as plant sex, you do have to consider it as, well, plant sex, other than pant sex, is basically just hay fever. Yeah, it's important to understand that hermaphrodism is not just animal, bird, fish, and similar related, but it does affect you in ways that you may not consider it. When you're walking around, sneezing and coughing because of hay fever, just remember you're being covered in plant sperm. This should bring us full circle about hermaphrodism. A hermaphrodite is not just a weird situation in which two sex organs are produced at once. It can be the development of one set of sex organs that change to another set. In some cases, it is the production of faux or proto-genitalia. In plants, it is somewhat simple but complicated at the same time. It's simple in that most of the same rules apply, but the sex organs and gametes are different again. It's complicated by plant diversity, sterility, cross-pollination, and more. And so, hopefully now you have a better idea of what a hermaphrodite is. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.